Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is NZXT's Kraken Z73. This is a 360mm all-in-one cooler and an upgrade to the X73 that I unboxed and reviewed previously. Now for reference, I'm going to be setting this up inside Lian Li's Dynamic XL case. I previously set up the X73 in, and so I'm going to be covering some of the same points, but I wanted to upgrade to the Z73 because I really like the look of it, and I loved the X73, thought it was fantastic, and since I was rejigging the specs of my machine, changing those out, I wanted to switch out the cooler as well. There was nothing wrong with the X73, but the Z73 that you're going to see here is fantastic for a number of different reasons. Now this is a cooler that will fit with a number of different sockets, including LGA 1200, 1151, 1150, 1155, 1156, 1366, 2011, and AMD's AM4, STR X4, TR4, Threadripper, and all sorts of other things. I'll include information in the description for all the specs that you need, but this is a cooler that's guaranteed for up to 6 years and will basically fit any of the modern CPUs and motherboard setups to deliver simple cooling within your case with a really nice and easy setup process I'm going to show you here as I go through this unboxing and installation. The highlight though is the 2.36 inch LCD display that goes on the front of the pump that allows you to customize what you see in the end, and as you saw at the beginning, can do clever things like show you the GPU and CPU load and temperatures on the fly with just a glance, which I think is absolutely amazing. But you can also see gifs and other readouts as well, and I'll show you that a bit later on. Now in the box you get 3 fans, and those fans for reference are NZXT's AERP120 fans. They're 120mm fans obviously, capable of running up to 2000 RPM max with an airflow of 73.11 CFM maximum and 36 decibels in terms of noise level. Again, quiet, and this pump and the whole thing is guaranteed for up to 6 years, as I said. Now, the Z73 is incredibly similar to the X73, except the pump housing looks slightly different. The outside edge of it is quite chunky, but as you'll see, has that nice copper housing. Also has pre-installed thermal paste, so you don't need to worry about that unless you're a snob and you want to wipe that off and put your own on, but the standard one is good enough in my mind. It does a good job. And obviously the radiator. Now I noted in the X73 setup video that the installation of the fans on the radiator is fantastically easy and hassle-free, and I'm going to show you that process here. But it's also worth noting that the setup and how you do this is obviously going to vary depending on your case and what you're trying to achieve. Like I did with the X73, I'm going to be using a push-pull setup where I'm basically mounting the fans to pull air in through the back of my case, pulling cold air in through the rear, with fans on both sides to keep it as cool as possible. Now, the cooler itself comes with a number of cables that obviously need to be plugged in. This USB cable that you can see here needs to plug into the pump head itself and then a USB header on your motherboard. You then have another bunch of cables which might look intimidating if you've never set one of these up before, but don't worry, it's really simple. Basically, you have SATA power which needs to plug in your power supply unit, 3 fan cables that need to plug into the fans, and then this connector that plugs into the pump head. And that's really simple process. This process is actually really easy. Basically, you're plugging this cable into the pump head along with the USB cable obviously, but then everything else is controlled from that. So the fans will then plug into that as well. I'll show you that in a second. This USB cable, you see, micro USB on one end that plugs into the pump head itself, and then the USB header that plugs into your motherboard. They're usually at the bottom, you'll find them there, and check out your motherboard manual if you're not sure where they go, but fairly straightforward. There's no control box or anything else to worry about. Everything's controlled from the pump and from the cam software, which I'll show you later on. It's a really simple setup process, one of the easiest I've seen in all-in-one coolers that I've tested out. I've tested out a fair few now. As I said, you have the other cable that plugs in here, this sort of flathead cable, that plugs in there too, and then that basically splits off into several different things. You have the SATA power that needs to be connected to power supply unit, obviously that supplies power to the pump head, and then you have splitter cables that have multiple different connections, as well as this cable here which connects to the CPU fan header on your motherboard to then let your motherboard know what's going on and control the power to the pump. and you can see there are a number of other connections. The SATA power, which is that flat one, and then there's an RGB controller, which is an optional one you don't need to worry about if you're doing the setup in the same way as me. And then you have 3 other connections, these fatter ones that are the fan connections, and basically once the fans are installed you then plug them into there. Inside the box you also have everything you need to set up between AMD and Intel. As standard it comes with an Intel bracket installed. You can see this other round one that is AMD's one, and then this backplate goes on the rear of your motherboard and plugs in. Then you have the connectors for AM4 and your fan screws. There are also thumb screws for screwing the pump head down on top of the standoffs, and there are some different standoffs depending on what CPU you're using, and I'm going to show you the ones I'm using. For reference, I am using an LGA 1200 socket Intel 10th generation Core i9 10900K CPU, and I'll show you the process for that if you're using a similar one, but the instructions in the manual are fairly simple for every other CPU that you need. Now, as I said, the setup of the fans is going to vary depending on what you're doing, what case you've got, and where you're planning on installing the radiator, and that's going to depend on your case as well. NZXT has guidance on the best way to set it up, but I am rebelling and doing it my way, because you find that it depends on dimensions of the case and where the best airflow is going to be. So as I said, I want to achieve a push-pull setup. So basically I'm going to be mounting it on the side of my case with the NZXT fans on the rear because they don't have any RGB, and then Lian Li's SL120 fans that you can see on the left-hand side here of the radiator. They'll be on the other side, and I've done a separate video on those fans if you're interested, but I'm also going to show you the brief setup process for those, but I'll link in the description to that other video where I'll go into a lot more depth on those. There's a very nice modular fans that basically clip together and then screw into your case, and they have a really simple setup process. As you'll see from NZXT's fans that I'm mounting here, each of those fans has a single cable, power cable on it, that then needs to be plugged into the pump head. The Lian Li fans, by comparison, have one connector per set of 4 fans, or in my case 3, that you need to plug into a control box. So there's actually a lot less cables on those fans. But the benefit, obviously, having fans on both sides of the radiator is you have better airflow flowing through, and it keeps it cooler. Now, you don't need to do this. I'm doing it, 1 for aesthetic reasons, because I want RGB fans on the radiator to show off RGB lighting within my case, and 2 for a mild increase in push-pull performance. There are other videos on the web from the likes of JZ2Sense and Gamers Nexus and such that show marginal difference in doing a push-pull setup, and it's not essential that you do it. I just have the fans and I wanted to do it because it looks nice with RGB. I did it with the QL120s before with the X73 and it looked really good, and the results are really good as well. It ran really well and looked really nice, and now I'm going to do it with the Lian Li ones. New radiators, new fans, just a nice new look. Now, it's worth noting, and I'll show you a bit later on, that the pump needs to be mounted in certain ways, but the LCD display can be repositioned by 90 degrees within CAM's software, so you can set that up as well. Now, the end results of what I want to achieve is obviously to get that RGB lighting. You could opt to pull the air the other way. You could exhaust, and I'll show you what I mean in a little while, with the RGB fans instead, and with the NZXT ones, and pull air out of your case. You could top mount the radiator. That's another option depending on the size of your case, but I'm not doing that in this case, and I'll show you why in a minute. Now, here's a quick and short overview of the Lian Li SL120 fans. Very nice fans, really nice looking, incredibly easy to put together. They just clip together like this in a modular way, which makes them really easy to install. And then there's just a single connector, as I said, for up to 4 fans, and then you can connect up to 16 to the control box, which comes with a triple pack. So these are insanely easy to install, and then obviously you just screw them in, plug them into the control blocks, and then plug them into your PC and your motherboard and things, and it's pretty simple setup process. But that's a separate video if you want to see more on that. The focus obviously of this video is on the Kraken Z73. Now, this is the Lian Li Dynamic XL, as I said before. I'll link to the unboxing video on this as well, so you can see my original setup of this. But basically, I know that the radiator will fit in here nicely, and that it will reach the CPU in a nice way as well. There is a video by Gamers Nexus, and I will no doubt get comments from people who haven't watched this video properly, talking about how you should mount your radiator with the pump cables at the bottom, if possible below the pump, because that leads to a better longevity Unfortunately, as I'll show you later on, that is not possible in this case. I tried it out and you cannot do it because the cables are too tight and they would pull basically across the GPU. If I didn't have a graphics card, it wouldn't be a problem. Obviously, if I'm top mounting, that's slightly different and you could potentially mount it on the bottom, but again, I found the way I was testing it out, it just wouldn't fit. I emptied the case out and tried it out in different positions and it just wouldn't fit. So this is still the great position for me. I don't suffer with pump wine, I haven't had any problems, and as I said, it has a 6-year warranty on it anyway, so I'm not worried about it. And the X73 was excellent in this position, didn't have a problem. Now what I'm going to do is to mount it in this way. I obviously have the fan screwed in. I've put the radiator behind the back of the case, so it's actually really hidden away, and all you'll see is that the pump cables and these fans. I'm basically going to screw the SL120 fans through the case and into the radiator, therefore holding the radiator in place, and that is how the whole thing is installed. It's worth noting that you do need to buy extra fan screws. Obviously those rad screws, you only get the amount for installing your standard NZXT fans. You don't get extras for a push-pull setup, so you do need to purchase them separately. Again, you can get these really easily. I'll link in the description to Amazon where you can get these fan screws, the long fan screws, easily, and they are really easy to get and then really easy to install as well. Now, just to demonstrate what I was talking about, now the setup process here is going to be installing the radiator in this position. There are two different positions, and I'll show you that in a second, that you can mount it in. And just for reference, here's the X73, just to show you. Now, I tested this before I put everything in, but I just wanted to demonstrate that it's not possible. So if you try and mount it the other way up with the cables at the bottom, you'll see the cables are not long enough. It's very tight. You could potentially do it. However, just to demonstrate that more closely, I put that flat and then try and put the pump head on top of where the CPU is and where the standoffs would be. And you can see already just how tight those cables are. There's not much room there, and if you have a large GPU, then that is going to be an issue. One, it looks messy. From my mind, it doesn't look great. And two, those cables will basically be tight across the GPU all the time. Now, this RTX 2080 Ti gets very hot under load. It's renowned for it because it's the Founders Edition. It gets up to like 85 degrees or something, and having those cables pushed up against there all the time doesn't seem sensible to me. I think I'd rather take the risk of a little bit of pump wine, which I don't suffer from, by the way, and just get on with it and have it in that position. Now, one thing of note is that I did make a mistake. You'll see here I put the fans on the wrong way around. This shows the importance of thinking about what you're doing before you're doing it. So I put the rear fans to pull air in and then the front fans to pull air out, so actually the fans need to be switched around. That setup change is quite easy, just unscrew them, flip them over and put them back again. Now, these are the standoff screws that you need to install the 1200 socket. You'll also find the other standoffs in there for the other ones, and as I said, most of them are included in the manual, but they don't mention the LGA 1200 because that's newer, so it's not written in the instructions. But basically you need the standoff screws at the same length on both sides. I've also not shown the clip of installing the Intel backplate. Basically there's a plastic backplate that clips onto the rear of your motherboard, and then it just pushes through the 4 holes on the rear of that, and then you can then basically put the standoff screws in place, and when you screw them down, that pulls the back plate in tight, keeps everything nice and tight. Now, as I was saying earlier on, installing the pump, you can install it in 2 positions, either with the cables on the right or below, and you can adjust the display within NZXT software at the end when you're all done to make sure it's lined up properly the way it's going to be. Now, I tried it in the 2 positions and I found that with the cables at the bottom, again, the cables are probably too tight, and with them on the right hand side it was also quite tricky because my RAM is quite close to it, something like it's pressing up against the RAM, so it became quite a fiddle to do, but it is possible, as you can see from the end, to actually mount it up that way. And I found if I push them out of the way and with a bit of convincing I managed to get it screwed down. Obviously you need to take care not to put too much pressure on the CPU or to damage anything, but then you're just basically putting the pump head down on top of it. As I said, it has the thermal paste applied already, so you're putting that down on top of the CPU and screwing it down with the thumb screws. Now, at the rear of the case, you can see here, We have the NZXT fans installed nicely on the back of the radiator, and there's actually a good bit of room in this case. It's one of the highlights of this case and one of the reasons I like it. Again, if you want to see a bit more in depth about this, check out my X73 unboxing and the original boxing of this case. But basically, there's loads of room and enough room to put a radiator and fans at the rear. The rear cover also has a dust cover on it, and still enough space that it doesn't press up against the back of that case. One thing that I have had a problem with though is there's a gap at the top, and you noticed I've cheated a little bit, or I basically used some of the back plates that come away from where the GPU is and stuck them on with sticky tape to cover over the hole that would otherwise be at the top of this case. That's a separate thing, that's about the case itself obviously rather than the fan setups and the rad, but a tip if you're using the Lian Li case as well. But what it does mean is that I now have 6 fans on the radiator, pulling cold air over the rad, keeping things cool and running that into my case. I also have 3 fans on the bottom of the case, pulling cold air in, and then 3 at the top, exhausting it. And I'm planning on getting another one to put on the rear eventually when those SL120 fans are a bit more easy to get, because they're a bit tough to get at the moment. But you can see it clips on nicely, and then we're away. It's now plugged in, turned on and running. And you can see a tease of what's coming already, although you've seen that at the beginning, but the NZXT Z73 display, which is almost certainly the highlight. Now this cooler obviously does a good job of keeping things cool. Out of the box on the default settings, you see it shows you the temperature of the liquid within the pump, within the radiator, and what that's running at. Don't confuse that display with telling you how much temperature your CPU's got, because the difference between the temperature of those two obviously depends on the thermal transfer and such. You can go into the NZXT cam software, which I'll link to in the description, and change the display around to show off a number of different things. Here I've got a dual infographic is what they call it, which shows the CPU temperature on one side and the GPU on the other. And here I'm running it in through Heaven Benchmark and Cinebench and other benchmarking tools just to give a demonstration of the temperatures that you get up to. And putting under pressure with Cinebench was getting up to 74 degrees in the CPU, but in general use for gaming purposes I found it was around about 50 degrees on the CPU, and that's not overclocked, that's just standard base clock. And then the GPU is obviously a separate thing entirely, although that's going to vary depending on the setup of the case, and obviously some cold air being pulled over the radiator is going to help with the GPU as well. But as I said, putting it under a bit of load. Now if you go into NZXT's cam software, you can adjust a number of things. You can upload your own gifs. You can use any gif and then resize it to the right size and put it in here and have whatever display you want on it, which is pretty nifty. I think it's pretty cool to be able to do that. Obviously you can customize and personalize the look and feel of the pump head and what you're seeing all the time. It can be a bit distracting obviously constantly having a gif displaying on the pump, but it's certainly nice and it's a good way to show it off to your friends and perhaps show off why you paid so much money for such an expensive all-in-one cooler. But you are getting what you pay for here, I think. A very nice quality setup as you've seen, and then a multitude of different options. Within the other options you can choose from all manner of things. So you can see you could basically just set it as a CPU temperature display all the time. You can go through and you can change how that looks as well, so you can change the color and the background of that, so where it fades between different color swatches and goes across the different areas. You can change the text color, the logo color, and the reading color. Unfortunately, it seems like you can't get rid of the NZXT logo on there, so that's permanently there. If that bothers you, then that's obviously an issue because there's no option to get rid of it, but the results are still nice here, and I think it's nice that you can customize all that look and feel. I actually end up using mostly the standard NZXT colors with just the purple and the and such. The results of that are pretty swish, but you can see you can tweak all the different colors to the way you want it. I actually said you couldn't get rid of the NZXT, but you could technically make it the same color as the background. There are plenty of other options to choose from here as well. You can see you can set the CPU load, the GPU load, GPU temperature, CPU temperature, clock speed of both of those things as well. So there's loads of options to show loads of different information on there too, as well as obviously changing to the gifs. Now there's a carousel one which is also really nifty, where you can basically choose from a number of those different ones and then have it cycle through them on a timed loop, so you changes between them. So rather than having one display or one with just 2 bits of information, you can choose to have multiple different displays, and then you see it as a setting for a duration of 5 seconds as standard, or 10 seconds, whatever you want to change it to. Again, you can also change the colors of each of those individually as well, so you can really customize that. I think having that changing, I find it, obviously it's going to vary depending on where you have it, but I find it a bit distracting out the corner of my eye to be constantly changing, so I like to have mine kind of static, but it is nice to have that option. You also have the option for spectrum wave and things. I don't think that the sort of standard RGB ring ones are as nice as they were on the X73. I feel like that look and feel isn't quite as good, but the reading ones are excellent. It gives you the temperature and load and all that. It's fantastic. Now, inside CAM software, you can also do a number of other things: senior system specs, overclocking, matching up with that other NZXT software. One of the things I did want to show you, which is interesting, is when I go through and run Cinebench, you can obviously see the CPU load and the pressure that's under. Running PC Mark and Cinebench at the same time, and I wanted to see what sort of pressure that put the PC under and the CPU, and then what temperatures it got up to. And you can see the temperature in CAM immediately going up, shooting up from the 40s up into the 70 degrees with 100% load, and you see the fan speed ramps up. You can change the fan speed within NZXT's CAM software, and obviously if you've got it connected up to your motherboard, you can do it within the motherboard software too. For reference, I'm going to leave all my specs in the description. I used MSI's Dragon Center, which you can see here on the left, to demonstrate another thing, which is that I noticed that the display on the Kraken doesn't always tell the exact temperatures. There is a difference. You'll see I have Corsair's IQ software running down the bottom here, and MSI's Dragon Center on the left, and then CAM on the right. And I notice there's a difference between what those 3 things tell you in terms of the CPU temperature. You see that the CAM software seems to show the lowest CPU core, as in the one that's the coolest, so it might not always be the most accurate reading when you're just glancing at the display, and I think that's worth knowing. You can see that Dragon Center software, for example, is showing around 38 to 40 degrees centigrade, whereas CAM is saying it's 34, and you can see then if you look at IQ, some of those readouts down there are in the low 30s as well, depending on what core you're looking at. So overall temperature obviously varies. But it's worth bearing in mind that that readout display on the NZXT pump head isn't necessarily 100% accurate, but it is still nice to have a look at as a glance and get an idea of what's going on. All in all, a fantastic cooler with loads of great features, really easy setup, and a fantastic look and feel and great results. Hope you found this video useful. Let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Hope you found it useful, interesting, hilarious, or all of the above. Be sure to check out the description for other information you might find interesting, and subscribe and watch these other videos as well that I think might be useful to you, and have a great life.